I said that I would try to clarify the relation between divine command theory and natural law theory. We've come at this juncture to the first point of contrast. Scotus, as I understand him, denies that the second table of the Decalogue, that's to say the Ten Commandments, those laws that deal with our relations to each other as opposed to our relations to God, that second table is deducible from our nature. Scotus wants to deny that. And the contrast would be with the deductivist view, namely that the second table can be deduced from our nature. So as to make the structure of this talk clear, I'm going to discuss 2 points of contrast. The second has to do with whether the moral law has essential reference to our good, where this good is indexed to us individually. This is the question about eudaimonism, the view that our motivation is always, in the end, to our own happiness or perfection. And I'm going to take it that Scotus denies eudaimonism. My paper would be more elegant if I could point to a medieval thinker who was, in contrast with Scotus, a deductivist and a eudaimonist. I could then proceed with the program of exegesis and modification and testing for consistency that I outlined above. What about Thomas Aquinas for this role? Here, I am going to weasel out of committing myself. I have made a lifelong practice of avoiding the attribution of views to Thomas Aquinas. My reason is prudential. I have found that different types of Thomists hate each other so much that any attribution of a view to Thomas is likely to occasion deep animosity from one group or another. And I am better off quoting texts when I need to and saying that one plausible interpretation is ABC, but that I do not claim the relevant expertise to know whether this is actually Thomas's view. So, one plausible interpretation is that he is a deductivist and a eudaimonist. But I freely admit that there are other interpretations by reputable scholars, and I do not know enough to know which is right. In any case, my project for this year, as I described it, is dialogue with a living natural law theorist and not a dead one. I am interested in seeing to what extent contemporary natural lawyers, for example, Jean Porter, are eudaimonist and deductivist. One question I do not think is a good one, as I said earlier, is to ask about these contemporary theories, are they really natural law theories? In the remainder of this talk, then, I'm going to talk about these 2 points of contrast, and I'm going to try to relate them to contemporary work in evolutionary psychology. That's why I entitled the talk, Divine Command Theory, Some Reflections on the Current Situation. I will start with the point about eudaimonism because what I say about it will have consequences for what I want to say about deductivism. It's not necessary for a natural law theorist to be a eudaimonist. Scotus, as I read him, is a natural law theorist of an idiosyncratic kind and is not a eudaimonist. There is, however, a congenial relation between eudaimonism and the rejection of divine command theory. To the extent that you think that our obligations are grounded in our happiness, there will be no need to appeal to anything outside our happiness, such as divine command, for the authority of these obligations. We will already have all the answer we need to what Christine Korsgaard calls the normative question, namely, why should I be moral, or why should I take the moral demand as the demand upon me? Scotus, by contrast, inherits from Anselm the distinction between 2 affections of the will, what he calls the affection for advantage and the affection for justice. The affection for advantage is a drive towards our own happiness and perfection, and the affection for justice is a drive towards what is good in itself, independent of our happiness and perfection. Aristotle's account of motivation has nothing corresponding to the affection for justice. The closest he came was his view of friendship, where two people who have the highest kind of friendship want to benefit each other, not for personal advantage, but for one another's sake. But this is not really a counterexample, because Aristotle's view is that in this kind of friendship, the friend is another self. This is what enables the friends to forget their own pleasure and profit, and the friendship is contingent on the maintenance of the special relation. Everything we do, on Aristotle's account, we do for the sake of our own happiness. Aquinas says, I quote, "Every man naturally wills happiness, and from this natural willing are caused all other willings, since whatever a man wills, he wills on account of the end." Close quote. One plausible interpretation of this is that he agrees with Aristotle on the eudaimonist point. But with the distinction between the two affections in place, the motivational question is more complex. Both affections will be operative in most of our choices. Scotus is not suggesting that we lose the inclination towards our own happiness and perfection. Even the blessed in heaven, he says, will have the affection for advantage. But there is one part of our motivation, the higher part, which is not directed towards the self. And this part has the task of restraining or moderating the lower part, so that we end up with a love for the highest good, God, for God's own sake, independent of our own salvation. The most vivid way to put this point is counterfactually. If God were to require us, which God does not, to sacrifice even our own salvation for the sake of God's glory, we should be willing to do so. This thought lies behind the words of Jonathan Edwards, repeated at the close of Presbyterian ordination services for generations. I quote, "I would be willing to be damned for the sake of the glory of God." These words echo expressions of Moses and Paul, and perhaps even of Jesus. Moses said that he would be willing to be blotted out of the book of life. Paul said that he would be willing to become a curse. And Jesus, in fact, took separation from his Father as the price for saving his people. Next paragraph. Now, I want to say a word about contemporary evolutionary psychology, though I need to say first that I am not an evolutionary biologist or an economist or a game theorist. I have been reading for the last couple of years in the literature about the evolutionary origins of morality. The discipline of game theory has recently undergone a significant shift, due primarily to new empirical data about choice behavior in certain games. To give you a flavor of the old construction, I will quote from Ken Binmore's book, Game Theory and the Social Contract. I quote, "Nature cannot achieve the first best outcomes to which those like Kant aspire, because the latter are not incentive compatible. That is to say, they are achievable only if the human beings who live in the society act in a manner that is incompatible with their nature." Close quote. What is this nature? It is homo economicus, he says. The assumptions about human nature to be made in this book are those of neoclassical economics. People are assumed to act in their own enlightened self-interest. Close quote. This last phrase is multiply ambiguous. But Binmore is opposed to Kant and endorses, by contrast, Hobbes's view. I quote, "Of the voluntary acts of every man, the object is some good to himself." This shows that Binmore is not merely claiming what Kant would also claim, that morality is in an agent's interest, and not merely claiming what Kant would also claim, that the moral agent is made happy by the happiness of others. The anthropology behind the theory of homo economicus requires that the object as purposed be self-indexed. And this is something Kant cannot agree to. The heart of the categorical imperative is that it is binding on an agent whatever else she wants, and so whatever she wants for herself. The universal law does not allow any special reference to the agent herself or her interests. Because of Kant's emphasis on the will, moral action is more than mere cooperation, though it is one form of cooperation. Suppose we define cooperation, as Martin Novak and Sarah Coakley do, as a form of working together in which one individual pays a cost in terms of fitness, whether genetic or cultural, and another gains a benefit. This definition does not say anything about motivation. Note that this definition is different in this respect from their definition of altruism as, I quote, a form of costly cooperation in which an individual is motivated by goodwill or love for another. Close quote. Skipping 2 sentences. In this talk, I will not use the term altruism, but moral motivation. Kant sometimes talks about moral motivation as practical love. So his account will fit under Novak and Coakley's definition of altruism, except that he insists that the moral agent is motivated by respect for humanity, both in her own person and the person of any other. If altruism is defined in a way to exclude this kind of self-concern, then Kant's account is inconsistent with it. I said that there has been a shift in game theory from the position I quoted from Ken Binmore and his insistence that society developed its moral rules to deal with repeated interactions by self-interested individuals. Here I will quote from Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. I have to do all this quoting because I'm an outsider in this discipline. This is in my access.